morning.
Good morning.
Well, I rewrote this front to back twice this morning, which is not at all unusual for me. Played around on Facebook for a minute and came upon what I thought was the appropriate opening for this. Changed the one I had planned on. Religion, like all other ideas, deserve criticism, satire, and yes, our fearless disrespect. It's from Salman Rushdie, who is in critical condition right now on a ventilator in a hospital as a result of being stabbed 10 times when he was on stage about to deliver a talk. So in view of that, I've hired Shyla and Charlie here as my security guards. Everybody comes near this stage while I'm up here. I've seen women shamed for being sexual, not being sexual, getting pregnant, not getting pregnant, having an abortion or not being financially able to support a child, going to work to support a child instead of staying home and taking care of it, accepting public assistance so they could stay home, putting the child up for adoption and not putting the child up for adoption, being so alluring it forced someone to rape them and then having the audacity to not want to carry the rapist's baby. This talk explores the biblical origins of the shame projected on women, which is most notably from Genesis. This talk is what I did with the anger triggered by zealous Christians on the Supreme Court negating Roe versus Wade, opening the door to the government making decisions that should A, be private, and B, be between a doctor and patient. It's bad enough that insurance companies sit between the two. If you don't think organized religion is the unseen force behind all of this, you aren't paying attention. You know, when I say I wrote this to deal with my own anger over the situation, I didn't do it to reinforce my anger or to encourage anyone else to be angry along with me. I did it as a way of processing through the anger and getting to forgiveness so that I can forgive these people that I don't agree with. We know words through our personal experience with them. For example, the word rape means something different to a woman who has been raped than it does to a man who has heard about rape. Some state laws banning abortion have exceptions for rape and incest if you can find a doctor and meet all the required criteria for the exception in the time frame required, which is designed to make it impossible to accomplish. Men who haven't been raped and don't have to undergo pregnancy, childbirth, or parenting unless they choose to, are writing these laws, which are never admitted to be about the control of women. Where did it all begin? In the beginning. You've all heard me say this before, and we'll hear it again. In my opinion, the Bible's opening, Genesis, is the most confusing and contentious part of the Bible. But the real problem is that this confusion and contention is the door to three major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Are we having trouble back there, Andy? Comprising 55% of the world's population. Islam is from the same Abrahamic tree of theology and has the story of Adam and Eve with some differences. Eve doesn't seduce Adam into eating the forbidden fruit. It's a mutual transgression. But like in Genesis, Adam is created first and Eve second, as a companion, but not as an equal. Genesis is rife with confusing and conflicted symbolism. Genesis has incomplete explanations that leave more out than in. The information gaps create misunderstandings, which become the basis for laws, worldviews, and cultural traditions. Genesis has literal claims that contradict physical evidence, passages that are open to many interpretations and/or contradict both logic and ethics. Having laid that biblical foundation, I want to veer into history for a short bit. In 1920, women got the right to vote. In 1963, the Equal Pay for Women Act was passed. In 1972, the Title IX education amendments were passed, making education discrimination based on sex or marital status illegal. In 1973, the infamous Roe v. Wade ruling gave women reproductive rights. And in 1974, the Equal Credit and Opportunity Act made it illegal to deny credit based on sex or marital status. These were all passed to undo discriminatory practices that targeted women and were commonplace. Racial issues aside, how many acts needed to be passed to guarantee the equality of men's rights? Why was any of this necessary? I say because our country has been much better at freedom of religion than freedom from it. The evil in Genesis sets the stage for the dark cloud over women's rights. This talk is a deconstruction of the first 2 pages of the Bible, that door to 3 religions. Genesis is folklore framed by men to set the stage for the discrimination against women that persists to this day. For centuries, women had little and sometimes no influence over society's directing assumptions. While the terms of the subjugation may have been different, whether rich or poor, subjugation was part of a woman's role in life. The subjugated, whoever they are, play a vital role in society. They take the blame. When raped, they're accused of being too provocative. When beaten, they're accused of deserving a beating. When wanting equality, they're accused of not being deserving. In Genesis, God created the earth and every living thing, including man, saw that it was good, very good. On this perfect earth, he created the perfect garden and then created man, also perfect, as he was created in God's image. In the garden, all was perfect. Now, there's some debate as to when Eve came along. As we'll see, most of you know that Genesis 1 and 2 are conflicting creation events. In Genesis 1:2-6, God said, "Let us make man in our image." And already there's a big problem. This is a monotheistic religion. One always in one God. Who's the us and our? There are many answers when you Google that question. None quite added up. One was that it referred to God and angels, but then wouldn't the beginning be the creation of angels? And not to stir the creation pot too much, but who created God? If there are other gods, it's a secret God is keeping from us. Genesis doesn't say anything about God toiling or having limited energy to create, so I'm not sure why he needed a day off after a mere 6 days of creation. Is he weaker than he lets on? Genesis 1:2-7, in the image of God he created, male and female he created them. Note this was a simultaneous creation, and I believe should have left at that. Later in the book we can glean that he wanted worshipers and servants, and from the virgin birth perhaps a lover. But in Genesis he only wanted an image. and there's no indication of why. In regards to what Genesis says, I'm particularly disturbed by the idea that God would create two humans, fully grown, without any life experience or existence experience, and thus without a context for anything, and expect them to obey. Without life experience, they have no idea why obeying might be a good idea. They've suffered no consequences from not obeying. In fact, they have no concept of consequences. Imagine how confusing it would be to poof into existence as an adult. We get 18 years to prepare for it, with instructions coming from all directions, and still screw up. Shouldn't the first few pages of the Bible be dedicated to Adam and Eve asking a maddening number of questions, after which God would have definitely needed a day off to ask himself, what have I done? I think it would have gone like this. What are we? What are you? What are we supposed to do with the life you've given us? Are we basically for your entertainment? Won't we get boring to you pretty quickly? Is that why you added the tree we aren't supposed to eat from? Is that a built-in drama factor? Do you know Jeff Probst? What? Oh, okay. We'll see you after your day off. In some respects, Genesis 2 is Genesis 1 with more detail. The problem is that the most significant details are completely different. In the beginning, tribes were coming together to form bigger tribes, and each came with their own creation myth. Genesis 1 and 2 may be the result of tribal blending, where differing traditions were being honored. In this blended family, Genesis 2 is like the stepchild of Genesis 1. In Genesis 2, we have something very interesting, a completely different account of the creation of man and woman. In Genesis 1, man and woman are created simultaneously. In Genesis 2, God created the earth and garden. Then in Genesis 2:7, God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. In Genesis 2:16, God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may eat. And in 2:17, we have the first prohibition. But of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. Back to the big secret about who else occupied heaven. Genesis 2:18, and God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper. This may be the original demotion of women. Sounds kind of like your cave's getting messy, you need a maid. God has empathy for man's loneliness, and we know that empathy comes from common experience. From various scriptures, we are informed that God is omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, can do anything, and omnipresent everywhere all the time. God uses his omnipotence to fix man's loneliness by creating animals. Wouldn't God have done the same for himself, created someone or something to keep him company in heaven? Being omnipotent, having experience with loneliness, wouldn't God have populated heaven? Why no mention of it? Something like, I have animals up here, I think you would like some too. I belabor this point as an obvious missing piece that contributes to the folklore nature of the story. Folklore is full of grandiose events, but often lacks the fine print. 2:20 tells us that none of the animals solved Adam's loneliness. 2:21 and 22 tells us that God took a rib from Adam and made woman. There was no mention of Mrs. God, so from what image did God make woman? Two things about this strike me. It is from an insignificant portion of man, a rib he could do without, that God made woman. The very idea of creating woman was not enough for God to start from scratch, as he did with man. Nor does he add the personal touch of breathing life into woman. And he brought her to man, the book says, as if to say, look what I made for you. From the moment woman appears, she is man's property. She was man's property before she was created, man's rib, and man's property after she was brought to man. Maybe a woman raped should be forced to give birth because, after all, women were brought to men. In Genesis 3, a serpent appears, more cunning than any beast of the field which God had created. The God had created part is interesting. And since nothing else is being identified as a creator, God gets the credit, with the serpent being the archetype for the devil, and the devil symbolizing temptation. We can surmise that God created temptation with something in mind. He also created two naive beings with zero defenses against temptation. Not even knowledge of good and evil, which he decided they should not have.
Okay.
If we pay attention to the Genesis story, we can only see it as a setup for establishing man as an eternal subordinate. But a human is subordinate to a God. That would not need to be established. Can we really imagine a being highly advanced in intellect, wisdom, and love having such a need? God's omnipotent, all-powerful. So even if we buy the fallen angel story attributed to the existence of the devil, God had to have allowed that angel to fall. We could call it the original entrapment. A lawyer would have a field day with this. In 3:1, the serpent asked, "Has God indeed said, 'You shall not eat of every tree in the garden'?" In Genesis 3:2, Eve tells the serpent she has been told of the one tree they are not to eat of because it will kill them. In Genesis 3, verses 4 and 5, the serpent says, "You will not die. You will be like God, knowing good and evil." Several things come to mind here. Nobody's warned Eve that there are creatures in the garden that will lie to her and attempt to trick her. She has no awareness that such lies and trickery exist. She's every bit the young child who was captured by a stranger offering candy, except that no parent has warned her to stay away from strangers or that strangers exist. Adam didn't know any more than she did, so he couldn't warn her. And the omniscient God chose not to. Given that her mind was a blank slate, how tempting would it have been to eat from a tree of knowledge of good and evil? Think about knowledge of. Having knowledge of something certainly means more than knowing that a thing exists. Had she already eaten from that tree, she would have knowledge of evil and might have recognized the snake as evil. Isn't it interesting to ask what God's issue was with Adam and Eve being like God? Isn't much of the rest of the Bible a request for man to be like God? Isn't that the crux of the Ten Commandments and 600 plus other laws of the Bible? Isn't the whole darn thing about being like God? In 3:6, Eve eats the fruit and gives some to her husband. There's no mention of her having to talk him into it. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. With her. She's not off alone. He's standing there with her, and there's no mention of him objecting to her eating the fruit. Why did he let her eat it first? Oh yeah, they told him it would kill her. Kill them. He wanted to see if she would die, in which case he could have God bring him another helper. I'm sure he felt he could spare another rib. In Genesis 3:7, the first consequence is that they realize being naked is shameful. This has always troubled me. If nakedness wasn't evil before they ate of the fruit, why was it evil after? And if God didn't want them to eat the fruit, then his intention was for them to stay naked. Now we're back to wondering if God created them for entertainment purposes. If he created them so that they could practice obedience, which might explain putting a tempting tree there as a challenge, why? What is God's fixation with obedience? Science is about the what, when, and how. Spirituality is supposed to be about the why. Why are there so many unanswered whys in this door to 3 religions? In 3:8, they hear God coming and hide. God called to Adam in 3:9 and said, "Where are you?" In 3:11, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat?" Omnipresent and omniscient, everywhere all the time and knows everything. God supposedly keeps track of billions of people, but in the beginning couldn't keep track of 2. Shouldn't he have shown up and said, "I know where you are, and I know what you've done"? Let's go back to that innocent child who hasn't been warned about the existence of deceiving strangers, because that's exactly the role Eve's playing in this saga. Uninformed, naive, inexperienced. In 3:12, before Eve can say anything to God, Adam says, "She gave me of the tree and I ate." So it may have been Adam's spine that God made Eve out of. God punishes the serpent, who by God's punishment we see as representing the snake. On your belly you shall go and eat dust all the days of your life. Punishment didn't exactly stick, as snakes can go in trees and in water and literally just about anywhere they want. And the serpent was right about them not dying. 3:16, to the innocent Eve, he said, "I will greatly multiply your sorrow." So we have a godly example of how women are to be treated. Any harm done to a woman that greatly increases her sorrow is justified by God. "In pain you shall bring forth children." This is the important part, ladies. "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Gee, I wonder why laws had to be passed for equal pay, voting rights, rights to credit, education, and bodily autonomy. 3:17 to 22, Adam, as innocent as Eve, is to go from a life of eternal leisure to a life of mortality and toil. They're both kicked out of the garden, and neither is immortal as they were before. So God punishes them for the rest of their lives, stripping them of immortality, making the punishment essentially eternal, and similarly punishes every human who comes after them for a crime Adam and Eve did not commit. Because if you have no knowledge of good and evil, you cannot be convicted of evil. And I know that sounds like something Rudy Giuliani would say. So in this male-written biblical narrative, billed as the inerrant word of God, we have an explanation for how evil entered the world. God created earth and a virtual paradise in the Garden of Eden. He put the perfect image of himself there, man, but didn't care to talk about why. Then woman, God's afterthought, is created. She makes a mistake, as innocent as a child touching something hot after being warned not to. She brings sinful disobedience into the human picture. She brings toil and pain and loses man's immortality in the process, not to mention condemning all of humanity to similar punishments forever. Her sin became the defining characteristic of humanity, rendering all of us to be born in sin as mere descendants of original sinners. Both the story of creation and the story of the fall have done a great disservice to women, paving the way for eternal discrimination. Namaste.